I'm on with Doshin Nelson Roshi, founder of Integral Zen, known as a poet, a troublemaker, and a teacher. Thanks for coming on.
It's wonderful to be here.
So I wanted to start with thinking about kind of the broader cultural moment that we're embedded in right now, specifically around the idea of victimhood. I interviewed a couple of sociologists about what they called the rise of victimhood culture. And the idea that they had was that morality is shifting from something that was based on human dignity as the fundamental moral virtue to how much of a victim one is as being the fundamental moral virtue. And I felt like there was something there that spoke to our times. So I'd love to hear from your perspective. Where do you think we're at with victimhood in this culture?
This idea of dignity, the dignity of man, is a really recent development. That showed up in the history of philosophy in 1495 by an Italian philosopher by the name of Pico, who wrote an essay called The Dignity of Man. It was a revolutionary new idea that human beings could have dignity. Only kings had dignity. Only royalty had dignity. That common people would have dignity was radically new. Interesting, huh? It was a page-and-a-half essay. You can Google it. It's fascinating to read. To look at the virtue of dignity and compare it to victimhood is a disconnect to me. I don't see any correlation between victimhood and dignity, human dignity. What I see as the archetypal factor is the rescuer, which is even more recent than dignity. It has just appeared since the 60s, this idea that we could be a rescuer, we could be a hero. Now, if you look at it in this framework, and you look at the polarity between the victim and the rescuer, then it automatically draws in a third thing, the perpetrator. The rescuer is going to protect the victim from the perpetrator. Now, this triad, we all, if we look deep inside, have a rescuer. Do you ever rescue anybody?
Yeah.
Are you ever a victim? Are you ever a perpetrator? The question is not, are you? Do you fill these roles? But are you consciously aware that you are? Now, in our current cultural milieu, where rescuers are very prominent, and everybody wants to rescue the victims, there's an unseen activity going on. The rescuer actually is unconsciously in shadow being a perpetrator.
Let's talk about that.
They're keeping the victim in victimhood. They're robbing them of the ability to take responsibility and step out of being a victim. It breaks my heart when I see this happening on the scale that it's happening in this postmodern culture.
Could you give me an example?
Sure. There are just thousands of examples. It's so hard to get someone to take responsibility in the business world. Everybody wants to play the victim, and the rescuers are always trying to rescue the victim so they don't have to take responsibility. I mean, you go into any business and it's a real problem that's interfering with the flow of business. You have to be able to take responsibility to fulfill your duties and your responsibilities in a particular job.
Yeah, and I think Jordan Peterson seems to be keying into that sense of responsibility as an important thing that specifically men, but every human being has not just a duty to, but also derives meaning from. So when we take responsibility for our lives, I think this is Jordan Peterson's message. We find meaning, and we actually bring our best to the world and make the world a better place.
How do you feel when you're a victim?
Powerless.
You are. What is your emotional state when you feel powerless?
Almost empty or sad.
So empty is a loaded word with me. I'm a Zen guy. Be careful with that one. Let's take sad. How do you feel empty? What emotion is feeling empty? That's not an emotion. What is the real emotion when you say you feel empty? What are you really feeling?
Yeah, it's probably sadness underneath that.
You feel like shit. You're powerless.
Yeah.
And do you like to be powerless? Do you enjoy feeling powerless?
Mm-mm.
So how do you feel when you take responsibility for something and you accomplish something?
Yeah. Well, empowered, but excited.
Excited, empowered.
Maybe a little fearful too, but excited because there's a possibility of change.
Fear and excitement are two sides of the same coin. If I'm afraid, I'm a victim. If I've taken responsibility, I'm no longer afraid, and I'm excited. So this is so prevalent everywhere we look in this postmodern culture. People being victims and avoiding taking responsibility and feeling huge amount of shame and self-loathing because they can't get anything done. This is epidemic in our culture, and it makes everybody feel depressed. You know, the whole field of psychiatry is prescribing psychotropic drugs to deal with the rampant depression and feeling of toxic shame that's so prevalent in our society. And the medicine for this is so simple. It's encouraging people to take responsibility and not be victims.
So what's the block when people don't take responsibility? Why not?
Fear of failing.
Is it fear of also not being worthy or not being good enough?
So this shame, this toxic shame, this story that I'm not worthy, I'm not good enough, this is a really relative recent development in human culture. The Dalai Lama, when he discovered that Westerners feel shame and self-loathing, was stunned. He couldn't believe it. He stopped the interview and he consulted with his translators. He just couldn't understand how anyone could experience self-loathing. It's not possible to experience self-loathing. Not in Tibet, at least before the Chinese invaded.
Yeah.
Self-loathing is the result of this relatively recent, more recent than dignity, addition to our culture of the idea of progress.
So is that coming along with modernity?
Yes, with progress you get modernity, you get the age of reason, you get the idea of success, and you get parents that push their children to excel. You get this idea of perfection. Now here is a real interesting way to look at that. Jordan Peterson, who I really enjoy, I mean, he's one of my heroes because he does something that I don't always do. One of my students named it. They named it skillful inflexibility. He takes a stand And he doesn't budge. And he doesn't let anybody trigger him. I'm not so good at that part. I'm a little more volatile. I'm really working on practicing the skillful part, which is the non-reactivity. And he has mastered that. I've watched his videos. Just how the hell does he do that?
Yeah, I mean, he sat in that Kathy Newman interview and just took it in a very nice way. I mean, he did push back, but it didn't rile him up.
He did not budge.
Right.
And he didn't get riled up, as you say. This is really significant.
Yeah.
So that's admirable. One of the things I love about Jordan Peterson is he really is a student of Carl Jung. And Jung's most brilliant student was a gentleman by the name of Erich Neumann. Erich Neumann escaped Berlin in 1934 and moved to Tel Aviv. It was a very wise move for a German Jew. He was disconnected from Carl Jung during the war. So he was left out on his own, and he really innovated Jungian psychology. He brought in a developmental perspective. He wrote a book called Human Consciousness, The History and Origins of Consciousness.
The Origins and History of Human Consciousness. Yes. Thank you. It's on my coffee table.
Yes, it's an excellent book. He wrote a book before that one. And in that book, he really brought forth the first Jungian perspective that include developmental theory to any degree. Jung was not a developmentalist. Erich Neumann is Ken Wilber's favorite Jungian for that reason, other than the fact that he's brilliant. Well, the book that he wrote before that book was called Depth Psychology and a New Ethic. And it was shunned by the whole Jungian community, even though it had a foreword by Carl Jung himself, saying that it was a brilliant work. In this book, it's just an incredible book. It's finally become popular. But in this book, he proposed that the old ethic is the ethic of perfection. And the new ethic is the ethic of wholeness. Now, these are ethical issues. If I have to be perfect, I have a moral obligation to be perfect. I take this very seriously. When it gets to deep moral obligations, some people are willing to die for them, and some people are willing to kill for them. This is one of the drivers of war, morality. So, if I take this and put it in a broader integral context with the philosophy of Wilber, Wilber is saying that we are on the precipice of a transformation in culture like the human race has never seen. The transformation from traditional culture to modern culture that happened about the Renaissance 500 years ago is going to be nothing compared to the transition that we're facing now.
So are you an advocate of the position that postmodernism is, in a way, a kind of the death knell of modernism? It isn't necessarily its own stage. It's kind of the end of modernism, and then whatever comes next is integral.
I can see that perspective, but we don't really know. There's not enough data yet. We are not going to know until looking back after the transformation, should the transformation happen. I can certainly build an argument that green, or this postmodern belief system that Jordan Peterson is taking a stand against, that Ken Wilber wrote a book called Boomerite, showing some of the problems of this postmodern belief system of beliefs and values. I can certainly build an argument that this is unsustainable. When I look at all the organizations that are founded with these principles, and they all take on the rescuing, of victims.
Yeah.
None of them allow the taking of responsibility.
Yeah, so there's this interesting dynamic in the work that I was talking about earlier, the sociologists. They were saying that victimhood culture arises in situations where there's actually high equality and high diversity. So when some of the main aims of the modernist project, which is dignity for everyone, equal opportunity, when those kinds of aims have actually been obtained, it's actually precisely under those conditions that a victimhood morality comes on the scene, because in situations of high equality and high diversity, people are in the mode of trying to make things more equal, trying to make things more diverse, because it really was worth worrying about that when things weren't very equal or weren't very diverse, but they're sort of still going, right? And so, in a way, the engine that created a more diverse, more equal environment is the same engine which will undercut that environment by sort of the green or postmodern approach.
You're implying some causal relationships.
Yeah.
And I look at it more synchronistically.
Tell me more.
It's all one thing. It's one whole movement. And to explain that, let me go back to what Neumann was pointing to. If you look at the evolution of culture, and you can follow the same evolution in individual psychologies. When let's just take the individual development of personality.
Sure.
When you're born, you really are a victim. You're helpless. There's nothing you can do about it. And if you don't have parents to look after you, you will simply die. All of a sudden, you start acquiring language. You start, many more things happen, of course. You're learning 10 million things a day.
Yeah.
But with language comes the development of a sense of self. This really begins with the terrible twos. So what you're really doing is you're going through a helpless stage where survival is it. Then you're moving into a stage of magic.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're moving into a stage of self-referencing ego as language really takes root. The infant says, "No, mine." All of a sudden there's a me here to get attached to things and to avert things. There's liking and disliking that are behaviorally expressed. Then that continues until the beginning of enculturation into the belief system of your parents. This happens around 5 or 6. This is all of a sudden, I'm here and you're there, and there's a relationship. So the first person perspective would be the development of self. A second person perspective would be extending this sense of self to a family and an ethnocentric group. This is a second person relationship. And then the third person relationship happens around puberty, if you're in a Western civilized culture. All of a sudden you start thinking for yourself. You start being able to differentiate objects that are separate from you and I, from good and bad, from right and wrong, from a dualistic perspective. All of a sudden the scientific method becomes possible. All of a sudden you start thinking rationally. And that will continue until you go to college and become more worldly. And you begin saying, oh my God, other people have different beliefs. Now this is in a civilized, first world Western culture. If you don't get stuck in a traditional religious church.
Not like me, yeah.
And it happens very naturally, right on cue. So if you look at those things, perfection is important. In first-person perspective, a perfect sense of volition, mine, yes, no. All of a sudden, clearly a sense of self that can make a decision. Volition comes online and is perfected under ideal conditions. The second person perspective, adherence to rules is perfected. And it's beaten into you, or rebellion is beaten out of you. I was raised in a German Catholic family. boy, physical punishment was the rule. Spare the rod, spoil the child. That was how I was raised. So, perfect adherence to rules. Then, in the third person perspective, about, the age of rationality, it's perfect reason. It's perfect objectivity. It's perfect success. This is what creates the problem of not good enough. If I have to be perfect at my reasoning and my success, then the fear of failing comes online. And the beating myself up comes online. Then the fourth person perspective adds in an understanding of the systems theory. All of a sudden we can see the environment, and we can see how science is degrading the environment. A third person perspective scientist can't see that. A Trump can't see that. Therefore, it's just a blind spot. And someone with a fourth person perspective doesn't understand why they can't see that, because it's so self-evident to them. And that's where the culture war starts. So perfect reasoning, perfect knowledge, this is modernity, this is the age of reason. Then postmodern, what comes online is the ability to see the environment and the systems and the whole. And the emotions come online because they're rejected at third person. So this idea of perfection, all of those stages are what Ken Wilber would call first tier. None of them have moved into the second tier structure, which is this theoretical change that we're right on the precipice of. And it will be a massive change.
So this is, okay, great. I have an objection, a challenge, a question, something like that, based around my understanding of Hegelianism. So integral theory seems to me to be a kind of neo-Hegelianism, in the sense that Hegelianism was a developmental theory and ultimately underwrote much of Nietzsche's thought, and correspondingly, people who tried to implement Nietzsche very dramatically, and you ended up with the Third Reich. You ended up with Mao. You ended up with societies trying to force the coming of the next thing, right? It's my view of Hegelianism anyway. So my question about integral is, are we forcing the next stage? Like, how do we make sure that we don't artificially create some integral stage that falls afoul of trying to change human nature the way that
So your
is?
whole argument is assuming that cultures are intelligent. They're not. They're not intelligent. It's the overemphasis on our ability to think. It's our arrogance and lack of humility and our narcissism that is causing this problem. It's not culture. Culture is just trying to keep the status quo the same. That's what culture does. Oh. This is where I remember Jordan Peterson. What he models. So this is a really important thing, but you're really attributing some intelligence to societies and cultures that they do not have. It's people, it's leaders.
Yeah.
Now, there's a lot going on in shadow, in collective shadows, that drive so much of this. But that's a different conversation. Mm-hmm. If we look dialectically, we have the emergence of this idea of progress that leads to an industrial revolution, which leads to the explosion of technology and science, which leads to huge problems that Marx, the antithesis, sees. If you want to criticize capitalism, Read Marx.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's
And it wasn't Marxism really isn't that related to Marx.
Communism.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Or
Yeah.
Marx's thinking isn't
Yeah.
necessarily what
I
communism.
studied a lot of Marx.
Right. Right. My fear is just that the same thing might happen within.
It already is happening. It's called postmodernism. It's not called integral. It's called postmodernism. This is the reaction to modernity, postmodernity.
Yeah.
This is where Jordan Peterson is really criticizing and equating postmodern egalitarian relativism, which is the ideology that's driving the symptoms of victimhood. This is an ideology as dangerous as communism was. It's not the integral. Now, from my perspective, so many of the people that say they're integral are really quite postmodern. This really complicates things.
So I'm going to ask a question that I don't think you're going to give me a straight answer to. What do you see is integral? What is the next stage? And beyond just the fact that it can see all other stages and appreciate them.
Integral is the medicine for the disease of postmodern egalitarian relativism. It's the medicine for the conflict that is crippling our culture and our society. It's not just one simple thing. It's actually a total re-education of the social sciences at minimum. What differentiates Ken Wilber from every other Western philosopher that I've ever read is he spent 15 years studying Zen. He spent 15 years studying Vajrayana Tibetan Buddhism. This differentiates him from any other Western philosopher. It puts him in a school all to himself. So there are actually 5 different things that you have to study, and you have to elevate yourself. Understanding an evolutionary perspective when it comes to personality development and cultural unfolding is one. Understanding the differences between the different states of mind, from a state of sentience to a state of enlightenment, is 2. And I mean viscerally understanding it. I don't mean intellectually understanding it. That is not going to cut it. Certainly not with a Zen master. And 3, it's understanding the different lines of intelligence, like the cognitive line of intelligence that each human being possesses, the emotional line of intelligence, the spiritual line of intelligence, the culinary line of intelligence, the kinesthetic line of intelligence. We can identify about 20 different lines of intelligence that all have the tendency to evolve along the same levels. The most commonly referred to levels of consciousness is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This is one of about 20 different developmental theorists, and you have to study them all to really get a sense of what we're talking about. Wilber has done this, and he's summarized it incredibly. So that's just 3. 1 is the levels of consciousness, the evolution of these levels. 2 is the states of awakening of consciousness. 3 is the intelligences. 4 is the different typologies. Jung's theory of types is a wonderful way to type people and understand them more deeply. The Enneagram is one that's very popular, the 9 different personality types. Masculine and feminine is one. The Tao, the yin and yang, is one. These typologies really increase our ability to understand and predict human behavior. And the 4th one is quadrants. The 5th one, thank you. The 5th one is quadrants. There is an interior space behind my eyes and between my ears. There is an exterior space that begins my skin and extends to the outer reaches of the universe, there is an I space in both of those, inside and outside, and a we space, a collective space in inside and outside. To me, this is a way to organize everything that exists and put it into its proper perspective. This has never existed in the history of man. We now have a conceptual framework that includes everything that human beings are capable of experiencing.
Doesn't that seem arrogant to think you know the totality of at least the categories of things that can be known?
It would seem arrogant if that's what he's saying. That's not what he's saying.
Okay. What is he saying?
That's a projection of what he's saying. So where would we look for the arrogance there?
I didn't use the exact words that you
No,
used.
but slow down.
Yeah.
This is really important.
Mm-hmm.
That's how you're interpreting what he's saying. That's not what he's saying. The truth is you don't know what he's saying because you're not listening to what he's saying. This is the problem we have with koan training. There's an enigmatic question that thinking mind can't answer. Nobody bothers to hear the question. The mind automatically moves to what's next and tries to think of an intelligent answer to the question. You miss the whole question. So that's what I'm witnessing your mind doing right now. You're not hearing what I'm saying. You're trying to think of something to say next. And you're missing the whole point. And you're misinterpreting what I said. And I'm not going to let you get away with it.
Fair enough. So what am I missing? I mean, I was just trying to get to the idea that you were
For the
saying,
first time in
Yeah.
human history,
Yes.
we have a conceptual framework that is big enough to include everything humans are capable of experiencing.
Right.
There's no arrogance in that.
It just seems like a big claim. I don't care if it's a big claim. I think that may be an objection that people might have when they hear that.
Only if they don't understand it. I want to share with you something that happened to me early in my understanding of Ken Wilber. This was a very humbling experience. And I'm so glad somebody had the balls to confront me on this. I was trying to fit everything Wilber was saying into the wineskins of my understanding of Carl Jung. And guess what? It was far bigger than what Jung was saying. And somebody did me the favor of looking me in the eyes and saying, "You're criticizing something you don't understand. Don't criticize what you don't understand, and you don't understand Wilber." Whoa. I am so grateful that person did that to me. Because I was the one that was arrogant. I was arrogantly thinking that I understood what he was saying. And I had no clue. And I didn't know it. I didn't know it. And he really held up the mirror to where I had to take the responsibility to really study what Wilber was saying. And I saw for myself that I was clueless. I was arrogant. I was assuming I knew things I didn't know. I hadn't read Wilber. I hadn't studied Wilber. And that is the moment that my studies of Ken Wilber began. And reading Wilber is difficult for me. It's like reading economics. My mind doesn't think that way. I have to read Wilber 5 times. I have to sort through it. It's difficult. Reading Jung is like cutting butter for me. That's the way my mind thinks. So I have little patience for people that criticize Wilber without knowing what he's talking about.
Mm-hmm.
In the same way, I share the gift that was given to me.
Okay, fair enough. All right, so I want to kind of shift gears here and think.
I'll bet you do.
I mean, I'll just say on that front, like I think I'm calling out something that I think many people would think,
And
when
they're all projecting.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, if that's the
Not
answer.
one of those people has really studied Wilber. And if they have studied Wilber, if they have an intellectual understanding, I'll guarantee you they haven't studied Zen for 15 years and Vajrayana for another 15 years. Therefore, they really have no clue what Wilber's really saying.
Yeah, so let's get to the Zen stuff, because I think this is fascinating, and it really speaks to the cultural moment we're in.
My favorite topic.
You are a Zen teacher. So, I'll just put a little bit of my own story on the table here.
Please.
In my own story, I was raised Christian evangelical, and spent a lot of time in that traditionalism. And then I left the faith, had a very angry atheist phase. And that lasted, I don't know, maybe half a decade or something like that. Then I did spend more time, and you can tell I'm telling this story in the integral levels, because once I encountered integral theory, it helped me organize my own story.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
It helped you
thought
make sense and give meaning to your own story.
It does, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's when it comes alive for you.
Yeah. And so then I spent some time with thinkers in the more like critical theory space, Foucault, Butler, thinkers like that. And then I started to be able to appreciate Christianity and my own experience of Christianity as something that wasn't all bad just because it was irrational, right?
Yes.
And then when in the last year or so, I've encountered, specifically Zen, and there seems to be embedded in Zen this experience, this kind of mystical experience. I think you refer to it as the subtle and non-dual. That experience for me, when I touch it, it's not that I haven't levitated on my cushion yet, but when I touch it, it feels very much like the experience I had as a kind of quasi-mystical Christian. And the experiences are somewhat, it feels like it's touching the same thing. And what was fascinating to me about the way that Zen seemed to interpret that is, if you're in a traditional framework, you're going to interpret the experience of non-duality as traditional. But if you're in a different framework, in whatever, a green framework, I'm not actually sure what it would be interpreted as there, or in an integral framework.
Non-duality. But it's not really non-duality.
So I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about non-duality, a really easy topic.
So we're going to jump into an exciting topic.
Yeah, and the very small topic of non-duality. So I'm going to read you something Alan Watts wrote. The most impressive fact in man's spiritual, intellectual, and poetic experience has always been, for me, the universal prevalence of those astonishing moments of insight which Richard Buch called cosmic consciousness. There is no really satisfactory name for this type of experience. To call it mystical is to confuse it with visions of another world or of gods and angels. To call it spiritual or metaphysical is to suggest that it is not also extremely concrete and physical, while the term cosmic consciousness itself has the unpoetic flavor of occultist jargon. But from all historical times and cultures, we have reports of this same unmistakable sensation emerging, as a rule, quite suddenly and unexpectedly, and from no clearly understood cause.
So did you have a question with that?
Yes. Tell me about non-duality in Zen. How important is it on the Zen path to experience that?
It's essential. But there's nothing you can say about it.
This is why I thought it'd be an interesting topic to talk about.
Yes. The best you can do is poetry.
You're a poet.
I am a poet. My favorite poem about the experience, and this word non-duality is thrown around so loosely it's become meaningless in this postmodern culture. What is non-duality? It's not if you can't talk about it, if you can't understand it, how the hell can you know what it is without practicing Zen for 30 years? And that's not always a guarantee. My favorite description of what I would consider an awakened mind is Dogen, 13th century Zen master. The empty boat is flooded with moonlight. I was raised Christian as well, and Catholic, worse than evangelical Christian. I just got through doing a keynote at the Integral European Conference, and my keynote fathered Brother David Steindl Rost, a Trappist monk. Beautiful man, in his 90s, lives in Austria in a monastery. Gratefulness.org is his website. And he and I just hit it off beautifully. Now, in a conversation, I wanted to have a conversation with him just to make sure that we would flow from his keynote speech into mine. And a term came up in our conversation that he grabbed and became the subject of his keynote, which he breathed life into the crowd with. The sacred secret of silence. This sacred secret is the key, the way that Jordan Peterson talks about, that unlocks the lock that's in the unconscious of silence. Anthony de Mello, who's another one of my favorite enlightened Christians, a Jesuit priest, died in the mid-'80s in a plane crash on his way to Denver to do a retreat. He said, our deepest longing as human beings is for unity with God. Now, I prefer Godhead or emptiness or silence, but I can understand, and coming from him, I can accept unity with God because he knows what God is. He doesn't believe in God. He knows God. He's become one with God. He says our deepest longing is for unity with God. And how do you attain unity with God? He asks. And his answer is silence. And what is silence, you ask? And his answer is meditation. And what is meditation, you ask? And his answer is silence. The sacred secret of silence. If you undertake this journey and never stop until you become one with God or Godhead, that's all you need. But it's a most difficult journey. And it's somewhere the sense of self, with all its likes and dislikes, all of its narcissistic ideas and opinions, does not want to go. Because the empty boat is flooded with moonlight.
So do you think that
Think? You're asking a Zen master if he thinks? Why would I do that?
Do you think that we're climbing the same mountain when we're on different traditions? So the Christian tradition is climbing the same mountain of maybe silence is at the top. The same mountain that Zen is climbing, the same mountain that the Baha'i faith is climbing, that Islam. Or do you think Zen is getting to something different?
The only water that will quench our deepest thirst is silence. All finders find one thing. All seekers are seeking deities. They're seeking bliss states. They're seeking high, subtle experiences. They're seeking to feel good, especially in the postmodern age. That's not what finders find. Finders, when they become finders, they find the silence. They find the emptiness, the darkness that's darker than dark. And as soon as they move and surrender to the darkness, they find the sacred secret of silence. The silent emptiness is not empty. There are two things here in this sacred silence that are not things at all, that can be directly experienced and must be directly experienced to have any idea what non-duality is. It's unity with God. That's what non-duality is. In this silence, the two things that aren't things that are here and accessible are pure, naked awareness, unpolluted by a sense of self or an ego perspective, and a sense of pure potentiality, the essence of creativity itself, the essence of all creation is here. Neither one of these are things, but this is the sacred secret of silence. This is the lock that's unlocked when you practice enough to become selfless.
When you practice enough. And I think there's something interesting about the way that Jordan Peterson in particular has reanimated religious interest, because it seems to be more concerned with the practice rather than the metaphysics or the theology.
Theology is just thinking. You can't think your way into non-duality. As Zen Master Sasaki Roshi said, it wasn't Sasaki, it was Beginner's Mind.
I have a quote right here from that exact book.
Wonderful. Before you read it,
Yes.
He said, think no thinking. Thinking will not get you to the deepest truth of who you are. Thinking is slow. It happens at the speed of thought. To penetrate through into the mystery, into the sacred secret of silence, occurs at the speed of light, not the speed of thought. You'll never get there at the speed of thought. Think no thinking.
Isn't this... So I'm just brought back to my own memories of Christianity. And I think on the one hand, I'm like kind of picking up what you're putting down. Like it makes sense to me. I can feel something there, and in my own phenomenology, my own experience, there seems to be a truth to that thinking isn't the path that's going to get me to my deepest self, I think is what you said, and that seems to resonate. On the other hand, it brings up all kinds of fears for me, because I was part of a tradition where the thought was don't think that much, right? And just trust me and give me 10% of your income or whatever it is, right?
Just do what I say.
Just do what I say. Yeah, exactly.
Just follow the rules.
Right. Yeah, that I've put in place and that
That's
benefit.
the traditional way.
Right.
So the traditional way won't cut it anymore. You can't go back. As much as I like Jordan Peterson and what he's saying, his solution to the problem, he equates postmodern egalitarian relativism to communism. It's an ideology. It's a problem. It's not going to rest until it spreads its ideology all over the world. That's the problem with postmodern thinking and beliefs. They are relentless. They will not rest until everybody thinks the same way and has the same values. His solution to that seems to me to go back to more traditional family values. Now, you can't ever go back short of a catastrophe. The only way I could go back to a survival mode of thinking is to have a brain injury. The only way you could go back to not thinking and believing everything that somebody told you is to have a brain injury. That's not likely to happen. So I'm not saying don't think. I'm saying don't get confused. Don't believe that thinking can see. Don't confuse insight and thinking. Thinking is the most valuable tool that we have. We don't want to get rid of the ego. We want to train it. We want to train it to do the bidding of pure selfless awareness and compassion. That is what non-duality is. The Tibetan word is bodhicitta, absolute clarity at the speed of light, and the selfless caring that arises, the first thing that arises in that absolute clarity. This is non-duality. But it must be experienced, and it must be lived. It must be realized to be real, and to be anything more than full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Just empty ideas, and not empty in the good sense. So I want to appreciate your thinking. I don't want to make fun of it,
Sure.
but I do want to help you see the limitations of thinking. Thinking is wonderful. We have all the medicine that we have, all the technology that we have because of thinking. It's the most valuable tool the human race has ever been given or ever developed. So it's not that we want to get rid of thinking, but thinking will not help you answer a koan. Thinking will not help you awaken. Thinking will not help you cultivate compassion. Thinking won't save us now.
So on that front, when I tell some people that I'm interested in Zen, one of the things that I hear back, it's a kind of common refrain, is, well, those guys, they just want to sit in a cave and meditate. They're not going out and doing stuff in the world. I mean, they don't know any specific Zen people. It's just, it feels like something inherent in the practice or the way of being that is Zen. It seems to lend itself to this kind of closed offness.
Yeah. Have I mentioned how I feel about people that like to have opinions about something of which they know nothing?
I think I heard you say something on that front.
Did you feel it?
Yeah.
And this is a criticism that I really direct toward myself. Everybody's got an opinion. They're like assholes. And that's one of the problems of this media circus of the internet. Anybody can get a camera and become a YouTube guru.
I'm not a guru yet, but
And even though you have the best intentions, if you, when I did this interview with Rebel Wisdom, it was amazing, the comments from people who had no idea, didn't know anything about me, had a lot of things that they thought about Zen that they were projecting onto me. When I just off the top of my head, I would say about 40% of the comments were favorable, about 40% of the comments were horribly critical, and about 20% of the comments were, it's just weird, right? That's kind of how it
that was
looked.
about it. Yeah.
So I looked at that and I was amazed. They had no idea who I was. The comments showed that they knew nothing about Zen or about any of the work that I've done. But yet, I really took the comments to heart, knowing that they were all projections. I mean, it's like Byron Katie says, we don't talk to each other. What we do is we talk to each other's projections, but only 98% of the time. So I just was stunned by everybody had an opinion, everybody had a like and a dislike. It was all ego projection, especially the ones that liked me. was clearly projection. They don't know me. They were all projections. Now, what I do with projections is I look at them and I think, oh my goodness, they have this crazy idea that they're projecting onto me. That means there's something in me, a hook to hold the projection. So I immediately start looking for those hooks. You know, I had just come off a really intense German retreat where I had called these Germans on something really important. I had violated the taboo. It was one of the most intense retreats I had ever led. And I went right into this interview. My energy was, and it was interesting because so that I could attribute some of the weirdness to. I was in a weird state of mind, right? Went right into this interview after that. So I really looked at the comments and I looked for what is it about me that allows them to hang that projection on. So there was gold in there for me, both positive and negative projections. But they're all projections, you know, unless someone has studied with me, unless they really know me, unless they know what our practices are and what we do and where our intentions really are. And what our successes and our failures are, it's all projection and a lot of collective projections. The most interesting one to me, well, there were two that were really interesting to me. Some people thought I was inauthentic because I laughed. Oh my God, if you wake up to any degree, the first thing you do is look at how ridiculously you hold yourself. You know, I think that I'm so important. Isn't that hilarious? Everybody can see that but me. And when I finally see it, I can't stop laughing. So the laughter was weird to them because they don't get the joke that they're not as important as they think they are. It was hilarious.
You're making me laugh.
The second thing was the way I was attacked for being against Jordan Peterson. I'm not against Jordan Peterson. I'm a fan. Like I said, his ability to not be triggered. I study what he does because he's a model for me. How can I do that more skillfully than I am currently doing it? So I really like Jordan Peterson. I think that Ken Wilber has a little deeper insight into what the solution is going to be for the problems that Jordan Peterson is calling out so clearly from a modern perspective. You know, from an integral perspective, you can see a little bit more of the territory. But I'm a fan of Jordan Peterson. I was blown away by the people that attacked me for criticizing Peterson. I just didn't get that.
And I also thought it said something about the kinds of people who would feel so much loyalty to Jordan Peterson that if he was at all criticized, it was wrong.
They took it very personally.
Yeah.
So that's
to be criticism is interesting and
this
helpful.
is a very traditional perspective.
Mm.
When you categorize somebody as black or white and they're either for you or against you, this is a very traditional ethnocentric mentality. And Jordan Peterson is attracting a lot of those same people that Trump is attracting for many of the same reasons. Mm-hmm. But Jordan Peterson is much deeper and much more sophisticated and much more knowledgeable. You know, he's got such depth. But it's really interesting to see the people that are being attracted to that and the people that see it as black and white.
So what would you say to those people who are attracted to Jordan Peterson who are interested in the message of personal responsibility? Because that's the camp I find myself in. I'm not in the traditionalist camp, but for me, Jordan Peterson saying, clean your damn room, you know, really spoke to me. It's like, well, I guess I should do that, you know?
Yeah, me too.
And my life got better when I started that
you
program.
You felt better about yourself, didn't you? You know, you remember how we started this conversation?
Yes, yeah, exactly.
How do you feel when you're a victim?
Right.
How do you feel when you take responsibility
Yeah.
and you start being empowered?
Right, exactly.
You know, a quick story. My wife, bless her heart, she's a saint. Married 39 years, and I'm not an easy person to live with. She decided she was going to get a black belt when she was 45 years old. And she chose one of the top 10 toughest kick 'em in the head Olympic-style taekwondo schools in the country. And 5 years later, 2 major ACL surgeries later, she had her black belt. And it scared the hell out of me when I watched her breaking wood. You know, I'm thinking, oh my God. I have a hard head, but not that hard. But I was so delighted in what happened. She took responsibility for her physical health, and it did so much to bolster her confidence that taking responsibility and accomplishing something, she is no longer a victim. It is the most amazing transformation that I've ever seen in 39 years of marriage.
So help me layer in some Zen goodness on top of this idea of taking responsibility for yourself. Because I feel like there's something about, at least my ego, that when I take responsibility for myself, yes, I feel more empowered and so on. But that does seem to be in tension with the notion of doing that from emptiness or from clear, deep heart mind. Seems like it's maybe my ego just going and taking over and getting the next thing and taking responsibility, as opposed to, I don't know, a more Zen approach. Help me understand that.
So you used the term Zen goodness, and I have to admit, I kind of got stuck there.
It's a technical term.
I'm not sure what Zen goodness is. But I'll do my best to answer your question.
Thank you.
So, if I am going to practice meditation, the practice is very fragile in the beginning. My ego will make up any excuse to not have to sit there and be in pain and be bored to tears and to focus and be disciplined. Make up any excuse, and my practice suffers. It's very fragile. So going to a 7-day retreat greatly enhances that, making the practice more robust. Joining a group where people are helping each other maintain the discipline and maintain a more robust practice is very helpful. And eventually, your practice becomes less and less fragile. Your ego can make up fewer and fewer excuses not to sit. Now, when you look back and your practice has become stable and robust, who do you think's responsible for that? Emptiness?
It's the ego in a way.
It's the ego. The volition. This first-person perspective, me. I cleaned my room. I sat there. I chose to discipline myself and clean out all these opinions and likes and dislikes which are causing most, if not all, of my suffering. I cleaned my room. I cleaned my room. And once your practice is robust, you can't even imagine having a dirty room, having a dirty mind, having a dirty heart, cluttered with opinions and prejudices and addictions and allergies. Oh, why would I do that? So Zen goodness is cultivating the discipline to clean your mind and your heart of all the pollution of self. Somebody has to choose to do that. If you got rid of the ego, who would make that choice? We don't want to get rid of the ego. We don't want to get rid of your ability to think and ask intelligent questions and question everything. This is your greatest asset right now where you are in your life. We want to encourage that. Zen is where skeptics go.
Yeah, I heard there's somewhere Zen requires great faith and great doubt.
Absolutely. The greater the doubt, the greater the awakening.
Oh boy,
you are it, aren't you? You're perfect. Little encouragement.
But anyway, it does seem like in the integral Zen tradition, there's like two. I'm sure there's more than this, but there's two axes of development. One is on this kind of awakening thing, which is independent of the taking responsibility. I don't know exactly what you'd call that. Is that roughly correct?
I would call it growing up.
Okay.
And cleaning up.
Yeah.
So that involves two things. It involves learning to sit, to get clearer, to get clean in what you see, in your insights, to cultivate insight. This is the waking up. The growing up is to begin to look at all these developmental levels and the different character traits that are added at each developmental milestone, each developmental level. And there are good ones and bad ones. We want to optimize the good ones and we want to minimize the bad ones. Arrogance, for example. Arrogance is important if controlled. Anger is important. It's energy and clarity if controlled and not allowed to just vomit out.
Yeah, on this front, this is, as I've been interested in Zen, this is one of the most interesting...
Did we just shift gears?
A little bit.
Okay.
Shifted books, at least. One of the most interesting things that I have discovered is this teaching, I guess it originated with Junpo, this idea that anger can be clarity, and it doesn't have to be violent.
Mm-hmm.
To me, based on my own history, that was a revelation. I'll just read a quick one paragraph that Junpo wrote on that. 2. Would it surprise you to learn that anger, from a deeper realization perspective, is sacred? The reason that's shocking to many is that we've linked anger with violence. Anger is absolutely not violent. Violence is a chosen intervention, a chosen reaction to anger. And so I think it's so audacious to claim that anger could be a choice, or at least violent anger could be a choice. And it's liberating at the same time, because that means I might actually be able to experience an event that would trigger anger and respond with clarity and compassion and intensity, as opposed to violent reactivity.
Mm-hmm.
Just a little insight I got.
Yeah, it's liberating, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
So this is not an idea that Junpo originated, but it is one that he absolutely did wonders with. It is the essence of a process that he brought into the world called the Mondo Zen process. It is the most transformative process I personally have ever experienced. I've been with him since he first rolled it out. In fact, he looked at me on that first retreat where he introduced it, and he said, "I want you to be our first Zen coach." And the reason he wanted me to do that was because I had burned the boats on the beach. I didn't have a day job. I had decided that I was going to follow this man. I finally found a teacher that had chops, and he was not going to get rid of me. And he didn't. Still hasn't. So this process started out as a simple 4-part process. We called it stop and drop. So you would imagine a time when you got angry. and you would call it up in your mind, and you would let the anger arise, and then the person sitting in front of you would go, are you ready? Here comes some big energy. You ready? So think of something that makes you angry. What makes you angry? Got it?
Got it.
What is it?
Parent yelling at me.
Criticizing you? Telling you what to do? Judging you?
Yeah.
Which one?
Disagreeing with me.
Disagreeing
vehemently.
with you. Oh, I'm going to disagree with you. Are you ready?
Yeah.
You're wrong. You're just wrong. Are you angry? Is it coming up?
Yeah.
Stop! And drop into silence. Did you notice in that moment of shock that your emotional reactivity was interrupted? And in that split second, there was absolute clarity. So what that simple process does is enable you to interrupt your emotional reactivity and drop into the silence of absolute clarity, Zen mind. And then from here, look what would be a more conscious, compassionate response than the anger was, the reactivity and the violence that you were just about ready to unleash. Can you see a more compassionate, conscious response than that violent reactivity?
Yeah.
Okay, now imagine yourself doing something that benefited the circumstances and not poured gasoline on the fire.
Right.
And now that you're imagining yourself doing it, find a time to do it and report back to me when it's done. So simple. So that is the simple first version of the Mondo Zen process, which evolved into 10 koans. And it had to include more than anger. Now, anger worked perfectly for me because I had an anger problem. That was where I was stuck. I suspect it would work well for you. I can smell it. But we discovered quickly that it didn't work for everybody. So while I was screaming at you, interrupting your anger, I was traumatizing the person over here. There was collateral damage. So we had to include shame, collapsing into victimhood, not being good enough. We had to include dissociation, which is really all three of these are forms of violence. Violence outward. If the anger can't get out, if we have a parent that's angry and it won't let you get angry, then the anger gets stuffed. It goes inside. That becomes toxic shame and self-loathing. The anger can't get directed outward, so it gets directed towards self. And if neither one of those things happen, if you just freeze and you dissociate, you go into your thinking mind or into your fantasy world, then it's violence against the relationship. This is a powerful transformative process. So there are 10 koans to deconstruct the ego, to stop the thinking and the feeling and the stories and drop into the absolute silence of non-reactive witnessing mind. And then from this clarity, the first thing that arises is selfless caring. Not idiot compassion. We're talking real compassion. Selfless compassion. And then now that you're fully awake and have attained this clarity of Zen mind, so what? How are you going to bring it into your life? What are you going to do with it? How are you going to use it to improve your relationships and the quality of your life? This is the Mondo Zen. And it is a dialectical dialogue between teacher and student, between facilitator and facilitatee. It's a game that we play. I'm a judo guy. We play judo. This is how I dealt with some of my anger. I learned to play judo. Kind of ironic, isn't it? So I have to play Mondo. It takes the edge off. I don't have to get it perfect. You don't have to get it perfect. We play, Mondo. And we see when our eyes sparkle, like yours are sparkling right now. Now, there's one more thing I want to say about anger relative to the process we just did. Okay. So if you look at the anger, what's beneath the anger? What's driving the anger?
In this case, for me, it's definitely fear.
Okay. So wonderful. So you're afraid, and then the reactivity, that the fear drives the reactivity of anger,
Yes.
of violence.
Mm-hmm.
So what's beneath the fear?
Sadness.
Yeah. Fear and sadness. Sometimes the sadness is underneath, sometimes it's alongside, but it's always kind of connected to the fear.
Mm-hmm.
You notice that?
Mm-hmm.
What's way below the fear and the sadness?
Yeah, it's caring.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This was a teaching of Jumpo that changed my life. I never at once realized that the reason I was afraid, which drove the anger, was because I cared deeply. This insight that underneath the fear was deep, selfless caring changed my life. I no longer had to get violent. I could just tell people how much I cared. If you hurt that child, I'm going to have to intervene and hurt you to keep you from hurting that child. I won't do it as an angry man. I will do it with great intensity, clarity, and at the speed of light.
Read a story once. It's about a Japanese warrior who went to go kill someone who was avenging his father's death. And as he was about to kill this guy, the guy spit on him, and he became angry, and he laid down his spear and he walked away because he didn't want to kill him for personal reasons.
An angry warrior is a dead warrior. Rinzai Zen, this form of Zen, is the samurai tradition. Soto Zen is the Zen of the farmers in feudal Japan. Rinzai Zen is the Zen of the samurai.
So Rinzai Zen is the tradition you're in.
Yes.
So if somebody's interested in Zen, why would they choose, or why should they choose, say, Rinzai over Soto? Or I think some of the audience that might be watching this might not know how to what's the next step with Zen.
Okay. So I always advise people to follow their heart, to follow their gut knowing, their deep intuition. Now, Soto Zen is the Zen of the farmers. The instruction in Soto Zen is to just sit. There's the cushion, just sit. That's it. No more instructions. How long is it going to take you to figure out how to sit, how to meditate? It doesn't work very well with Westerners. Rinzai Zen, we, on the other hand, say, we teach people how to meditate with koans. What is the sound of one hand? What is your true face before your parents were born? Is it possible to just simply listen? And then we give you 20 years to actually answer the koan. So Soto Zen, the Zen of the farmers, they're cultivating patience. Rinzai Zen doesn't cultivate patience. We're impatient. They call us impatient Zen. They call Soto Zen patient Zen, the Zen of the farmers. So one of the things you can do is, are you a patient person? Soto Zen. Try that first. Are you an impatient person? Rinzai Zen. Try that first. The only problem is, this sitting around waiting for things to grow. You have to just sit for 20 years to wake up. And that's if you really work at it with a good teacher. So 20 years. Boy, I'm an impatient guy. Do you know how long it takes to impatiently answer koans? Takes about 20 years. So it doesn't really matter. But what does matter is pick your teacher very carefully. It's like picking a spouse. You're going to spend a hell of a lot of time with them. Make sure you pick the right one. So that's where I would say really focus on who the teacher is and what the chemistry is between you.
On a broader cultural level, what is the vision of how Zen saves the world? Does Zen save the world? Is that worth
How does Zen save the world?
Does it? I mean, is that because like in Christianity, the vision is like, we'll get the message out to enough people, right? And they'll...
Before anybody starts worrying about saving the world, first save yourself. Take responsibility for your own awakening. When you've attained absolute clarity and selfless compassion, you'll know exactly what to do.
Doshin Roshi, thanks for coming on.
It's been a pleasure. It's been fun.